Thank you, Maria and Andrea, for hosting me, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. Hope you can see. Oh, I just forgot that you might need to change the display so you don't see a stack of people in front of my slides. There's not much to see on these slides, but there are a few things you might want to read. So I'm gonna, you can hear me okay, right? And see me okay and see these slides okay? Everything's cool? Okay.
Yes.
All right, well, yeah, I have this talk that is it's close to an hour, and I realized that could get really boring if I didn't have some visual component to help guide us through it. So I threw these together kind of at the last minute, so forgive me if they're in all these different fonts and different different layouts and probably out of order and things like that. Probably lots of typos. But I'm grateful to all of you for showing up today and indulging me here. So yeah, the title that I've offered is Emergent Musicalities. And if you saw the abstract, you know, often we write abstracts that are kind of aspirational. And so this is such a case. We'll probably get towards what's in the abstract at the very end of the talk. But I kind of have to get there first. So let's see if it will let me. So as you heard, I am a music maker who has made it my practice to explore the limits of what I think music is, or what it has been to me. I've made some music of my own, and I've also been fortunate to collaborate with music makers across genres, communities, geographies, and generations, and across disciplines as well. I'm also still occasionally, and maybe a little reluctantly, a music scholar. One of my long-standing hopes is to challenge the music cognition research community to rethink the role of the humanities disciplines in the study of music. If you are a scientist, then there's a good chance, no offense, that like many scientists, and I know because I have been one in the past, or have tried to be, like many scientists, you may harbor some doubts that the humanities are in fact disciplines at all. You might think that they just describe in elaborate detail, and yet with infuriating imprecision, observations that are better experienced firsthand. You might think that they dwell on anecdotes and exceptions rather than data and measurable trends. You might imagine that they highlight difference rather than sameness, particularities rather than generalities, culture rather than genes, the social milieu instead of the biological niche. You might think the humanities to be a trivial extension of common sense, parasitic on the verifiable, peer-reviewed findings of science. But the issue here is that we are studying music, which, as polyvalent and volatile as it is, seems to cut across those oppositions. Music is identifiably present in every culture on Earth. This would seem to provide evidence for sameness and a motivation for the overall project of music cognition, teasing out the species-wide universals of how we play and how we listen. Yet also, almost by definition, music produces cultural difference. Music is the means by which a community says, this is who we are. And by extension, if you don't know this song or rhythm or dance, you're not one of us. Like language, music is one of the cultural expressions that allow a community to establish its boundaries, its sense of the limits of us. My early academic work, beginning with my 1998 dissertation, helped introduce the notion of embodied music cognition. And I had to kind of just trace this to see if that was right. And it seems like it was, because I don't really see many mentions of that concept before. So anyway, so that makes it partly my fault, and I'm sorry. My project was informed by Black music makers, Black musical systems, and Black methods, critically confronting the Eurocentric frameworks of music theory, musicology, and music cognition. I've argued for an understanding of music as, first and foremost, embodied human action, the sounds of bodies in motion. As the composer and pianist Cecil Taylor once put it, music is everything that you do. I was led into this line of thinking in the 1990s and 2000s through the generosity of various Black music makers and thinkers across generations. George Lewis, Ollie Wilson, Robert Porter, Donald Bailey, E.W. Wainwright, Mohammed Bilal, Will Power, Steve Coleman, Imani Uzuri, Amiri Baraka, Butch Morris, Roscoe Mitchell, Amina Claudine Myers, Wadada Leo Smith, James Newton, Jerry Allen, and many others. It was through Black music making communities that I first encountered generations of philosophical and literary and historical and political thought that today go under the name of Black studies. This vast field encompasses both constructive and deconstructive work. Writers and theorists from W.E.B. Du Bois to Zora Neale Hurston to Amiri Baraka to Houston Baker have identified and theorized aesthetics of Afro-diasporic expressive practices. These projects exist in productive counterpoint with the trenchant interventions of Black feminist theorists, including Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Wynter, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, and many others who have sought, by training the critical tools of literary and historical analysis on the archive itself, to destabilize and topple the conceit of Western man as the idealized transcendental subject. I am sharing these lists of names to highlight how humanities methods have challenged what is known, particularly by looking beneath existing systems of knowledge and investigating their emergent histories. Today's humanities scholars ask the hard questions: who gets to define what is knowledge and what isn't, and why? Who are the supposed repositories of knowledge? How is knowledge held, stockpiled, transferred, and by whom and why? These questions are nagging ones, annoying, repetitive, even tedious, but these are the questions that have brought about the epistemological revolutions of the last 5 or 6 decades. They are why, for example, Black studies, feminist and queer theory, ethnic studies, and decolonial theory have given space for the production of new forms of knowledge and have transformed our understanding of the violent, imperial, and genocidal histories of the last 5 centuries. These persistent humanities questions are the reason why only 30 years ago it was finally uttered out loud that women's rights are human rights, and why today it is also finally possible and crucial to say that Black Lives Matter and that trans rights are human rights, and why we can and finally must assert against the strictures of the modern nation state that no human being is illegal. The pattern here is that the most trenchant humanities questions have literally extended the very category of the human being, legally and otherwise. They have revealed this category to be not just biologically given, but evolving, contested, constructed, regulated, and constrained by powerful institutions, the state, the law, the church, the university, the scientific enterprise. Elsewhere, I have argued that the category of the human itself, that contentious, fraught, conceptual battlefield, is also the category of music. What I mean is that far from being a biological fact, music too is an ideological battleground, a space that is not universally agreed upon, but is discursively constructed and policed to make it seem as if it were so. Most commonly, the music made by people on the edges of the category of the human, the abject, the dispossessed, the incarcerated, the enslaved, the illegal, the disabled, the marginal. Their musics are similarly ejected, violently hurled outside of the category of music. As I mentioned, I am at least partly responsible for the phrase embodied music cognition, This is something I sometimes find myself regretting, or at least feeling a little ambivalent about. Not because the phrase is doing too much, but because it's not quite doing enough. It's still centering and extending what we've been calling cognition, rather than truly centering bodies, rather than focusing on ensembles of bodies in relation. It still foregrounds our intelligence, intelligence rather than our truly embodied, situated, interdependent nature, the animals that we therefore are, to borrow Derrida's phrase. This phrase, embodied music cognition, also tends to imply a focus on individual experience, despite the obvious fact that we as individuals could do literally nothing without each other. Individuality is itself a historically specific idea, seemingly aligned and perhaps entangled with the modern nation state, and Euro-American history in particular, with its official, discursive, and political arrangements around individual rights or the lack thereof. We could say that communities and individuals form part of a system. Perhaps it could be asserted that individuals are the irreducible elements of any community, but equivalently, it must be remembered that individual cognition can never exist outside of community. Historicizing all such categories will prove important in our conversation today. Situated music cognition is, you could say, either embodiment's flip side or its logical corollary. I was at pains in the dissertation to try to always keep them in balance, mention them together, but the word situated kind of slips away in the last 20 years. It kind of starts to fade in relative significance. Situatedness denotes the simple fact that music literally takes place, that it is happening somewhere, and that somewhere has a structure, and that structure matters. We could break it down into environmental affordances, the handles on our world, and instruments interface with your hands or your mouth or your feet, your proximity to acoustically reflective surfaces, your position relative to a PA system, say, or the simple constraints of the finite speed of sound through the medium of air, which relativizes and localizes the very possibility of simultaneity or unison. Sound's dispersal and attenuation over distances also makes music ultimately a local experience, socially up close and even intimate. The micro Doppler shifts that enable you to hear that sound sources are approaching or receding. These could all be considered environmental affordances, and they form the substrate for music making and listening, for all communal sonorous action. When the psychologist J.J. Gibson famously introduced the term affordances, now very much an important keyword across many disciplines, from engineering to literary theory, this term had a way of subsuming or concealing what is otherwise kind of blandly called the social. But the most important part of the structure of musical place is, of course, other people. Perhaps situatedness doesn't even explicitly cover what we mean. I used to employ the unwieldy phrase environmental and sociocultural situatedness, which made the word situated work a little too hard. So let's agree to always treat what we are calling embodied music cognition on at least three levels: the anatomical, this thing called bodies, or this assembly of things called bodies; the environmental, these things that we call places, which also include what we call affordances; and this realm that we call the social, in other words, relations among beings. So these three together are what are all kind of meant by what we're calling embodied cognition. Whenever human beings are involved, none of these three strata should ever exist in isolation, or can ever exist in isolation. They are all inextricable from one another. We should never try to talk about embodied cognition at only one of these levels at a time. Embodied beings cannot exist in complete isolation from one another or from their environments, despite the degrees to which modernity encourages us to think otherwise. And even this notion that I've been using of affordances, J.J. Gibson's idea, it's not merely an aspect of the environment. It is the interaction between a body and its environment, right? Like if you're rock climbing, you find a ridge that can be a handle, right? So it's about the interface between the body and place that actually constitutes the affordance. It's this assemblage of body and aspect or attribute of the environment. And similarly, bodies are socially constructed. Now, and this is something that humanists are fond of saying. When we do that, we're not just trying to sound woke. We are studying the discursive limits of the very same supposedly scientific, supposedly biological category. The question of what attributes are assumed to belong to a normative, able body, and the question of whose bodies are systemically excluded from this conception, even in what I just said, for example, about rock climbing. The realm of the social is not a benign, idyllic, happy place where embodied beings eternally gather in peace. Rather, it is that same contentious, violent realm that we know today, a world fraught with inequity, mass suffering, and endless precarity, a world where human beings form arbitrary alliances to dominate, exclude, and dehumanize entire subpopulations. What I mean when I insist that bodies, places, and relations are taken together is that in this mess of a world that we know, we have to take that mess as the same world in which any so-called cognition is theorized. This very compromised, deeply complicated, massively unequal, difficult, and tragic system of relations in which we have found ourselves. There are more limits to this phrase, embodied music cognition, but I think the most important one for today is that it presupposes music as a stable category. Some universally identifiable, clearly delimited object or substance that we're calling music. The contemporary Western conception of this category is profoundly constrained, and scientific discourse about music is profoundly limited by this conception. We must critically examine and historicize the dominant conception of music itself, the category that is taken for granted in this field. We have to historicize a contemporary use of the word music, analyzing it as a contingent, historically specific concept. Our understanding of music today is bound up with our technologically mediated, market-dependent listening experiences, which condition us to think of music as an object or substance that is nameable and consumable. This is bound up with the fact of recording technology that enables music to travel without bodies. Our conception of music additionally depends on Western epistemologies of aurality, instrumentality, and humanity/animality in the last half millennium of European imperialism and exploration and enlightenment and enslavement, genocide, and extraction. As European explorers, and I use that term in quotes, encountered their racialized others, they believed indigenous people to be at the edge of the human category. And subsequently, they took their musical behaviors as noise. They, like today's scientists, discursively delimited what human music must and must not be. The entire bustling research field of music cognition has long operated from this limited, profoundly Eurocentric, and profoundly historically circumscribed working definition of its topic. I've argued for years that this field's object of study is not so much defined as it is asserted and propped up in a manner specific to Euromodernity. The supposition of what music is conditioned by Western rational man's myths, is just so stories about himself. Scientists who engage in such lines of inquiry generally fail to bear witness to their own cultural embeddedness. Hypnotized as we all are by such myths about the ontology of music. Among those myths are the fantasy that there can be music without music makers, that music is a disembodied, unmarked substance that flows frictionlessly as though through an online service, that it is born of a solitary mind, not of a multitude of people with bodies in real space, that music is thought rather than experienced, that music making requires training rather than acculturation, that music is abstraction rather than action, that music comes to us rather than from us, that the we whose brains like music are not the same we whose bodies, minds, and hearts labor to make it, that listeners exist a priori in a state of social isolation, and also that there is a clear line between music and non-music, that music is a stable and uncontested category with fixed boundaries, rather than a fluid category that is continually made and remade. This runs counter to what the composer saxophonist Charlie Parker once said. They teach you there's a boundary line to music, but man, there's no boundary line to art. Instead, we must listen beyond our last century of sound mediation, beyond the last 5 centuries of racial capitalism that undergird Western science and reason, and re-examine what music might have been on the timescale of thousands of centuries, the era of human sociality. As a thought experiment, let's just consider what would have had to be in place for anything resembling music to happen prior to the relatively recent advent of electronic recording and amplifying technologies. Suppose that you time traveled to exactly 200 years ago, December 5th, 1822, and somehow heard music. What this would have meant is that somebody or some bodies had to be singing or stomping or clapping or playing instruments within earshot of you and your fellow observers in a space where they could be heard and not drowned out by other sounds, and that it would have shown up to you as none other than the sound of human action. That means that stringent conditions of sociality had to have already been met. In other words, the social is not an element that gets added to music after the fact. Rather, it is humankind's being together, our sociality, that facilitated and conditioned music making in the first place. Music was always precisely the sound of an us, of people in community doing things together, signaling, synchronizing, and organizing sonorous actions in the realm of the social, the space of us together, the only realm where people have ever lived, which is also the realm of music and the context of all human life. Music is the sound of people listening to each other, bodies listening to bodies, bodies interacting in sensorium, bodies in relation. What I wrote down in 1998 was, music is embodied human action, the sound of bodies in motion. For the most part, I stand by this assertion, but it's useful to look again at its limits. One of them is purely discursive. Today, I might say music is the name that we give to certain kinds of sonorous embodied human action. This is to remind us, like I've been saying, that the category of music is itself a human discursive creation, a made thing. Limiting music to the sonic means that other forms of action, like dance, are frozen out of the category. And what of the limits of the category that we have called action? Is feeling and emotion action? Is sleeping an action? Is aging an action? How about being born or dying? Furthermore, where are the collective actions such as assembly, protest, uprising? More generally, what would constitute a more radical, as in starting at the root of things, more thorough follow-up on all of the implications of the embodiment hypothesis? This thing that Andy Clark and Chimera and others call radically embodied cognition sets itself up as against representation of the total environment, for example. We do not simulate the world internally and then make calculations inside of that simulation and then take action. We interact with the environment through sensory guided action. Our brains mediate sensation and action in context by learned methods of relating to the world. Is music making then a form of sensory guided action, a way of exploring and relating to the beings and environments around us? So let us study these possible systems of relation rather than focus on essences like music as an object or a category. A friend of mine once told me that I seem to mobilize against all nouns, and that, as you hear, I've been doing that. I've been chipping away at every big fat noun that comes my way, like music or like the human. This is, like I said before, part of this critical humanities method that I think will become clearer, but I think it is compatible with the scientific method as well. What if we think not about your brain on music, but your brain as music? Can we open up the category, as artists so often do, by attending to the musicality of everything that you do, to use that Cecil Taylor quote again? What else that is made of human action or human embodiment could be music? And Leslie, let's agree to adopt these humanities methods, and particular methods from Black Study or Black Studies, as it is variously named, and the epistemological shifts initiated by thinkers at the margins of dominant categories. By Black Study or Black Studies, I don't only mean the study of Black people or Black cultures. I also mean Black thought, and particularly the Black study of the human being. For example, how is the category of the human being understood by people who were historically denied membership in that category? How might Black music makers inaugurate new forms of human relation, new social arrangements, what Sylvia Wynter might call new genres of being human? I think that something that happened with my early work was that it kind of was treated as specific to jazz. And actually what I was trying to do was point out that these musics, these Black musics that I studied, point to something else that has been left out of the conversation in music cognition. So this is what I mean by extending the category. Going to go through a bit of stuff about time, because one consequence of embodiment is that things take time. So let's take it as a given that music is, like everything else that we do, temporal. We don't need to define music in order to assert that, but let's allow it as a category that includes the ways we sound with and for and among each other in time. You could say performative, sonorous co-presence. So what is time? Well, the same J.J. Gibson I mentioned earlier, quite influential psychologist, he wrote this chapter in 1975 that had his title threw down the gauntlet. It was called "Events Are Perceivable, but Time Is Not." Here are some quotes. I don't know if you can see all of it, but I'll read it out. "There's no such thing as the perception of time, but only the perception of events and locomotions. These events and locomotions, moreover, do not occur in space, but in the medium of an environment that is rigid and permanent. Abstract space is a sort of ghost of the surfaces of the world, and abstract time is a ghost of the events of the world." He goes on to suggest that the very concept of time is merely a memory or ghost of the visual flow of our surroundings as we move. The traveler is tempted to think of the linear path as the dimension of time, and to see the path traveled as the past, that to be traveled as the future, and the division point as the present. The point here and the moment now coincide. One has foresight of the future and hindsight of the past. It is from this analogy, I suggest, that we get our conception of time as divided into past and future by the instantaneous present. But this does not mean that the dimension of time, pure time, is experienced during locomotion. What is experienced is a moving self in a stationary environment. This actually lines up with none other than Isaac Newton, who introduced the parameter of time in order to work out equations of motion. Not that time was this absolute quantity that exists, but that it is a parameter. It's a mathematical parameter. That's all it is. It's motion that happens. Time is the thing you use to parameterize motion. Time then seems to involve the availability of movement, but also the ongoing feeling of bodily presence. The feeling of now, or the present moment, Gibson suggests, comes from proprioception, that is, from the perception of the body of the observer himself, as distinguished from his environment. It comes particularly from locomotion and very largely from the visual perception of the locomotion of the observer through the environment. So this perspective on the illusion of time is very compelling. Of course, it emerges from descriptions of a body taking a solo, as it were, a very lonely stroll through space-time. There's nobody else there. But being among others is a more originary scenario for humankind. Intersubjectivity is how you begin in your biological mother's womb. This is Deborah Kapchin talking about body in the book Keywords in Sound from 2016. She writes, "The body wakes to the sounds of the body. Blood and heart rhythms in an ocean of amniotic fluid. It is another's body, the body of the mother, but it is the same body. The body of the mother and child, a symbiosis of sound. From the beginning, subjectivity emerges from intersubjectivity. The one is born from the many. We resound together. Then, of course, you are held and carried and guided, nurtured by others for a decade or two. The so-called self is always already an inter-self, a trans subject. When music becomes a part of your life, it is in a process of relating to others through shared experience, which, it goes without saying, is also temporal. So continuing in the vein of mobilizing against all nouns, you can probably predict what I'm about to say. Not only is music an open-ended category, but so is time. What we call the temporal is best viewed not as one thing, not one category or quality or characteristic or sensibility or experience or realm, but rather an assemblage of different machineries. Very much like Bruno Latour's reassembling of the category known as the social in his 2008 book, Reassembling the Social. We could say that there is no single temporal dimension, but many. No domain of reality to which the label temporal or in time could be attributed. That time is not a context in which everything is framed, but rather a set of types of relationships within and among bodies and objects and environments. Here is a not exhaustive, but pretty long list of temporal machineries we can attribute to ourselves in relation to one another, arranged roughly in ascending duration, and you may beg to differ about the sequence. Maybe some are longer. They're all fuzzy categories or fuzzy ranges of activity. Brainwaves, the different kinds of brainwaves, audition, echoic memory, speech, phonemes, syllables and words. Part of what I did in my dissertation and in the article that Maria mentioned was highlight musical activity on the time scale of the phoneme, that is hundredths of a second. This is what I called expressive microtiming. It happens in the context of pulse. When there's a regular pulse, then there are ways to express, to rhythmically express, have a varying and meaningful dynamic relationship to that pulse. Phonemes, syllables, words, the heartbeat, the infant sucking reflex, walking, these are tactus, of course. Then the kinematics of all the things that our body is, are effectors, you could say. The fingers, the hands, the arms, the torso, the hips, the legs, these all have different time constants, you might say, associated with them. Breath, the time scale of the phrase, of a sentence, of a musical phrase. Melodic verbal phrases, sentences, thoughts that are often kind of sub-vocalized in sentences or fragments of sentences. Then there's this other, so these are, some of these are periodic, some of them are kind of come in bursts. Surges and ebbs of emotion, physical sensations like pain or arousal, what we might call the body chemistry. These happen, think about like getting mad when someone insults your mom. How long does that take? It might take a minute to sink in, a few seconds to sink in before you find yourself getting mad, right? That has a finite time scale, that time scale of arousal that is also very much active in music, the time scale of a crescendo or a ritardando. Elimination, different things that the body does. Short-term memory, sexual acts, oratory, like me giving a talk, conversation, the rhythm of exchange, the imagination as its own sort of, the brain is in the body. That's our whole premise. So this is that has its own sort of time scales associated with it, you might say. Eating, the cycles of the mouth and chewing and swallowing and those kinds of things. Eating a whole meal. REM sleep cycles, which might be 90 minutes or so. Social gatherings, rituals, ceremonies, which might be like an evening or a day. Long-term memory starts somewhere in this range, but it can span, as a lifetime. And when we think of like the sonata allegro form as making use of the affordance of human memory, like when there's a return of a theme after, say, 10 or 15 minutes, that's making use of long-term memory. What about if that theme reappears like days later or weeks later? Is that still musical form, or is it outside of what we call musical form? Going down the list, journeying, working, gathering, hunting, gardening, building. These are sort of day-like events or day-like practices or processes. So then we have, of course, circadian rhythms, which are environmental days and embodied days, right? The rhythms of our body are also tied to the rhythms of our environment. Common diseases may have an arc, like a few days, a couple days, maybe longer. Ovulation cycles of the human species, environmental months, those are also tied together. Onward to social and political and cultural movements or moments, fads, fashion, the so-called froth of culture, the so-called zeitgeist. Seasons, groups of months. Gestation, an entire 9-month cycle. Harvest cycles, environmental years. These, of course, are again like us being tied to the cycles of our world. Architecture, building large-scale human projects like building a village, building a city. Then we think about longer star cycles, and this perhaps is, as humankind gazed at the stars and noticed these cycles and thought about the different relationships that the body already has to the cycles we know, maybe those longer cycles were also acting on the body in some way. We can think about the time scale of a lifetime. We can think about the aggregation of communities, the time scale of a culture. We can think about family, generations, cultural memories. We can think about systemic aggregations of power, like the rise and fall of civilizations. Environmental and climate change, which is incremental. Yes, so these like large scale time spans that we think of, we don't think of those as musical. Once we exceed, say, the circadian cycle, the rhythm of a day, we stop thinking of it as a musical cycle. We think of it as something else. But is that necessary? Or maybe what I can say more clearly is what we call music seems to aggregate among the first 20 or 22 elements on this list. The modern category of music, what we call music, tends to happen within one circadian cycle. I'm going to shift gears here, talk about becoming musical or becoming music. My earliest musical memory, how am I doing on time, by the way?
We are 7 minutes to 5, but we started a bit late, so.
Oh, okay.
Just talk for as long as you want. It'd be good to have 15 minutes of discussion. So yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, we'll be in there. That's fine. Now I'm going to shift gears and start talking about this thing that we call musicality. My earliest musical memory, indeed perhaps my earliest memory at all, is from age 3 or 4. I had started violin lessons, and my beloved older sister Pratima, then 6 or 7, had started on piano. My parents had gotten her a modest spinet on which she would work through her Suzuki repertoire. Her little piano loomed grandly over me and my 1/16 size violin. Similarly, I found myself looking up to her as my sentinel and guide through childhood. One day, I heard her playing something I did not recognize from her Suzuki practice tapes. She was clanging around in what was probably A minor on the piano. It involved a lot of white keys and a lot of sustain pedal. At some point, Either that time or the next, I toddled up beside her and clanged along in counterpoint. Together, we got the instrument resonating and shaking until it felt like it might tip over. I call this a musical memory. Is that the right word for it? Little me, together with one of my favorite people in the world, engaged in collaborative exploratory play, forming sonic experience, making a joyful noise, surely breaking a few rules. Even then, I must have thought, could this be music too? Instantly, I was hooked. And in fact, to this day, every time I play the piano, some part of me is transported back to that ecstatic, timeless, transgressive moment from childhood. You could call it my origin story. When I was a teenager in the 1980s, I took violin lessons with a professor at Eastman School of Music named Oliver Steiner, a contemporary of Itzhak Perlman, Emanuel Ax, Pinchas Zuckerman, and others. He had been a pupil of the legendary Juilliard pedagogue Dorothy DeLay. My father used to drive me to Mr. Steiner's home for lessons every week, and many insights from those lessons have stayed with me ever since. Aiming to refine my playing, Mr. Steiner used to call for fluidity of motion in my bow arm, my wrist, my fingers. He loved to demonstrate on the giant rubber plant in the corner of his studio, giving one of its gigantic dinner plate-sized leaves a nudge with his bow. He would ask me to observe the plant's undulating response, the gentle oscillatory sway of a branch. With warmth and sincerity and a little mischief, he'd say, "That is how I want you to play the violin." My late father loved music. One time on a night that I can't forget, probably about 35 years ago, my father was driving me home from Mr. Steiner's house. In the car, as he drove down Elmwood Avenue, I put in a cassette of some music with an infectious rhythm that somehow caught hold of my dad's soul. He turned up the volume and started tapping along, tablaing the steering wheel, then rolling his neck to the beat, then singing along, making up his own tune, then honking the horn in these wild spasms of joy, irrespective of other drivers or the quiet houses around us. The awkward teenage me was mortified by this madcap eruption from my mild-mannered father. These three scenes, my sisters and my cacophonous clanging, Mr. Steiner's swaying plant, and my dad's little bit of car horn ruckus, bring me to the following question. How does what we might call musicality emerge in such unlikely moments from objects or actions that do not seem to belong in the category we know as music? How does ordinary experience become musical? A couple of years ago, aiming to try to pry open this category, I posed a question on Twitter following the form of a popular meme. Some of you may have even answered. What's not music, but feels like music to you? This post received an avalanche of responses. Cooking, a really good conversation. Longing, dancing, weather, grandparents, people being insulted in Yoruba. Construction sites, water droplets, door creaks, astrological planet alignments, white noise, different tones. My youngest son's gentle snore, my older son's footsteps, my daughter's laughter. The wind through desiccating leaves, dogs barking, the unfolding of an exquisite meal, shafts of sunlight through slow-moving clouds. Astrology, astrophysics, poetry, the crunch of leaves on a crisp Chicago autumn day, looking deeply in the eyes of a lover, traffic, the groove a washing machine or dishwasher gets into, the ocean, love, memories, roller coasters, touch, thought, everything. Hundreds of people from around the planet offered examples of what feels like music, eliminating the contested edges of the category, tracing out a much larger space of musical mattering, affectively charged attending to sensory experience. These included human and non-human actions, complex sensations, emotions, thoughts, and meaningful social relations. The category of music encompasses many behaviors, but is also surrounded by this vast sea of experiences that feel like they belong in the category too. So rather than pursue a definitive question like what is music, we can ask more inclusively, what in the realm of human experience might feel musical? Under what circumstances, how and why? And what is that feeling? What constitutes that feeling? Feelings are not trivial. They are somatic activations at the intersection of biology and culture. As those tweets revealed, virtually any experience can feel like music to somebody, and they cannot be proven wrong. What if we say that music is felt into being? What if we treat the category of music not as one that closes or coheres, but rather instead as a sphere of experience opening out endlessly to human possibility? Oops. All of this has led me to a consideration not of music per se, but of musicality. Why musicality? Because there's something wrong with it. By now you've noticed that I care about what words do, and this M word first began to trouble me productively a few years ago. In English, the term has at least two senses. In the realm of aesthetics, it connotes musicalness, a communicative or affective value, the quality of being musical. Musicality is not the same as musicianship, the technical ability to quote unquote play well. Aesthetically, musicality seems to point not just toward, but beyond music, toward an experience of connection or a shared feeling. Good performances of music are often described circularly as very musical. A speaking voice, which ordinarily does not sit within the category of music, might still be praised for its musicality, a surplus aesthetic, relational, or affective potency. Meanwhile, in scientific studies of music, the term musicality is used to posit a biologically determined capacity for music making, a capacity that presumably all humans share. In recent years, the so-called music sciences have coalesced around a research program concerning the quote-unquote origins of musicality, a methodical inquiry into how humans became musical creatures. Musicality supposedly denotes a human capacity for music, but the categories music and human, and for that matter, capacity, are only further specimens in our endless zoo of unstable nouns. For hip hop doesn't qualify to many scientists as music. Drumming isn't music. Chanting isn't music. Scientists think they know what music when they hear it, and a lot of our most cherished sonorous human actions don't seem to count. There's the rub. As a biological capacity, the object of scientific study, musicality is said to be possessed by all humans, but as an aesthetic judgment, musicality reveals itself only among a select few. Musicality is both ubiquitous, that is species-wide, and exceedingly rare, attainable only in moments. It is something special, but everyone has it. Musicality somehow both precedes and exceeds the category of music. Like I said, there's something wrong with this word. It gets used as a cudgel or an all-purpose cipher. But the underlying concern is about how or when music establishes its own musicalness, how human action becomes musical. So therefore, let us repurpose this strange word, musicality, as a critical concept, opening up the category of music as continually being remade, made and remade. Then we can start to pay attention to how new musicalities emerge. There's my title. New embodied relations among beings and objects. A young girl and her little brother attacking a piano. A violin teacher nudging a plant leaf for his student. A father joyously honking along to the car stereo. I've got about 5 more minutes worth. Is that okay? All right. There is one key thinker who I believe can rescue this conversation, the influential Jamaican writer and cultural theorist and polymath, Sylvia Wynter, now 92, who has written trenchantly around the intersections and fault lines of the humanities, sciences, and Black studies. Lately, I've been hovering around her work because it exactly addresses the problem highlighted in this conversation. In the article, Unparalleled Catastrophe for Our Species, or To Give Humanness a Different Future, a transcribed conversation with the scholar Catherine McKittrick, Wynter asserts, let's see if I got this quote. What I'm putting forward as a challenge here, as a wager, is that the human is a hybrid being, both bios and logos, that is, biology and the sign, biology and myth, together define what it is to be human. Humanness is no longer a noun. Being human is a praxis. She calls for us to relativize the West's hitherto secular, liberal, monohumanist conception of our being human, its overrepresentation as the being of being human itself. We need to speak instead of our genres of being human. Once we redefine being human in hybrid, mythic, and biological, mythoi and bios terms, and therefore in terms that draw attention to the relativity and original multiplicity of our genres of being human, all of a sudden what you begin to recognize is the central role that our discursive formations, aesthetic fields, and systems of knowledge must play in the performative enactment of all such genres of being hybridly human. So this might be a way to rehabilitate the very popular claim that music makes us human. Yes, when you take human to mean not just the biological fact of us, but what the stories we tell ourselves about who and what we are. To this end, she considers the site of Blombos Cave in South Africa home to the earliest pieces of human art ever found, a 77,000-year-old etching in ochre in a humanly organized crosshatch pattern, in the context of what is further revealed to be a 100,000-year-old workshop holding the tools for art making. It is found among evidence of catching, cooking, and serving shellfish, an originary site filled with all the ingredients for culture making, a cave by the sea, where humans have gathered with their creations and creating anew, nourishing and grooming one another, marking objects with images for future generations. Wynter unpacks the significance of these art-making practices around this master symbol of processed ochre, specifically what she calls the symbolic transformation of biological identity, as ochre, the material, comes to represent human blood. What is revealed is, what she says, the praxis of the ritual initiatory transformation of the first form of life, biologically born individual life, into what she calls the second form of life, communal, fictive, or symbolic life. She suggests that we might need these orienting myths because they make the category of the human, not just a scientifically defined biological creature, but bios plus mythoi. And so she seizes upon a rehabilitative, reorienting originary myth that regrounds that category, the first instance in humankind's cradle of a ritual of human symbolic transformation of biological identity. So where is music inside of all of this? Well, it had to be everywhere. What might a human life world sound like? A scene of sociality among artisans and others gathered inside the echoic caverns of Blombos Cave, 90,000 years BCE. If we want to consider what might hold about music on the scale of the human species in all of its genres of being human, including music you will never hear, made by people we will never meet or even know about, people from Europe's last 5 centuries and people who died almost 1,000 centuries ago in coastal South Africa, it's perhaps necessary to rethink music as an ancient, embodied, communal ritual practice straddling both biology and myth, as one of our ancient practices of transforming mutual embodied human presence into something symbolically significant, something that matters. In closing, then, I submit that it is not music, the thing, or musicking, the action, but musicality, the relation that binds and defines us. Let us agree that musicality denotes an emergent quality, establishing musicalness or becoming musical. When we call something musical, we confer a special value on it, much more rare and important than mere music, that ubiquitous substance that wallpapers modern life. Musicality means that this moment matters. It is an entirely subjective and culturally specific quality, an affective relation with the sonorous actions of another being or object. It is a quality that can emerge in innumerable ways, only some of which we can imagine today. Musicalities arise as embodied, which is to say, affective and temporal relations among beings and objects. Not just sound making, but sonic mattering. Our domain of study should be musicalities, humankind's varying modes of sonic relation and sonic mattering, rather than music, the object, substance, or action that we think we know today. Musicality should not be treated as the all-purpose scientific buzzword that it has become today, but rather as a plurality of dynamic, speculative, affectively charged ritual relations, liminal zones of experience whereby human beings across the eons have sought to experiment, create, and commune, to hail and be hailed, to hold and be held, to lose themselves and be remade, to become part of something larger than themselves. Musicalities then are continually being unmade and remade across humankind's thousands of centuries. They are nothing less than our genres of being human together. Thanks. That's all I got. Thank you all for listening. That went a bit long. I appreciate you sticking it out with me.